So welcome to the third installment of the Geocaching Podcast Profiles. This time we're going to be talking with the guys from Cache&Release. So Michael and Gary, welcome to the interview. And we're going to start off with an introduction of each of you guys. And we're going to start with Michael since you started the show. So Michael, give us a little bit about yourself and, that kind of stuff.
All right. Well, everybody knows I have the website and the podcast Caching. I'm sorry. Let me start that all over again. Cache&Release. My name is Michael Miller, and we've been doing this show, Gary and I, just over a year now. And surprisingly, we'll talk about it later on, this is not my first podcast.
All right. Gary, what about yourself?
Well, I'm Gary Slinkard. Been geocaching almost 10 years. It'll be 10 years right at Geo Woodstock, so that'll be kind of fun to celebrate 10 years. But and I have only been on the podcast with Michael since about June of last year. So for me, I came in about 3 or 4 months into what Cache&Release began. So and I've only been on this podcast. Well, I've been a guest on other podcasts, but yeah, I joined with Michael, and fortunately, I'm still on the show.
Which you can't say for Caching in the Northwest because you've been banned from that show now.
I have been banned, although my appearance had a lot of views. So I'm going to really push Chris and the company that they have to beat my views if they're going to be complaining about me being on their show.
Well, let's kick off with what is the Cache&Release podcast?
All right, well, I'm going to take that one. And then, Gary, you can kind of jump in because things have, I would say, kind of modified since you've been on the show. But the Cache&Release podcast obviously was focused on geocaching, still is. But my intention starting the podcast was to make a show that had a format that didn't take itself too seriously. I wanted to mainly focus on bringing other people in and do more of the interviews, which is something that I really enjoy. Is I am not the most experienced geocacher, so getting to talk to other people is the thing that I enjoy. And when I was listening to other geocaching podcasts, that was the thing that I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to talk to people that are well known in the geocaching community, or people that are very experienced, and learn more from them, but also have fun doing the show. And I think every geocaching podcaster or podcaster in general will say they want to have fun doing the show. And I want to, if you look at our mission statement, it does say we want to entertain you. And I try to do that in pretty much every show that we do, that you leave kind of laughing, whether you're shaking your head at something that we've said or done. But that's generally what I kind of think of as the Cache&Release podcast. And Gary, you might have a different take on that one.
No, I think that's very accurate, and I think that the our chemistry, I think, really makes our show. We really play off each other real well, and I think we really have found a really good mix of what we cover and what we kind of talk about, and we really are very host or guest heavy, and I really like that part. Michael and I talked about, I guess it's been about 6 months ago, I guess. Michael and I kind of had we talked about it a little bit, and we really kind of had a meeting of the minds and said, let's keep going on with, and mostly this was Michael's idea, but I really agreed with that. We have such a good process in the show, and also within the show, just being able to play off of having a guest on. And so it really has become, I think, a really good. I really like the show because of that.
Well, in the live Q&A, which is open, Limax says he's been listening since about show 4 or 5, and it's always been a lot of fun.
I want to apologize for the first 5 or 6 shows there.
Oh, don't apologize.
I went back to number 1, so
Don't apologize. Those were good shows, and that's something I think really comes out, and really got me interested was just Michael and his personality and his enthusiasm for geocaching. And it's funny, my exposure to this was really through Gearheads and Daryl putting Michael's link in the Gearheads website. I think really helped, and that got me to go investigate, and then of course the rest is history. So that's kind of interesting how that started.
Well, I have to say that there's not a lot of podcasters who can pull off the solo gig. And Michael, I thought you did a very good job of pulling that off, especially those first few episodes, because it's not easy. But as you were mentioning, this was not your first podcast.
No, and actually, it's interesting you brought up the solo gig, and then I'll step back here because when you were introduced talking to Caching in the Northwest, Wits End actually brought up a podcaster that I tend to listen to quite a bit, which is Ricky Berganti, who's well known here in Orlando. And Ricky's one of those guys that can pull off a solo podcast and keep you entertained and engaged. And I tend to listen to podcasts I like, but I tend to learn from them also. But originally, for me, for podcasting, I actually back in 2000, I had a small podcast. I think it was 2006. I actually started a small podcast on BSG about Battlestar Galactica, and it was terrible. You can't find it. Look around the internet. You're never going to find it.
We're gonna find it somewhere.
It was terrible. It was bad equipment. It was just bad. But a couple of years ago, about 2012, my wife and I started a podcast about Walt Disney World, kind of taking off from another podcaster, well-known, Lou Mangello. My wife and I are huge fans, and that kind of got me started in a little bit more seriously into podcasting, but it was predominantly her and I back and forth. We only had a few guests on, and then a couple years later jumped into doing the geocaching, podcasting, because I felt like I had learned enough that I felt like I can establish something a little bit more long term. So every podcast that I listen to and everything that I've done, I've learned. And it's just like any startups. A lot of people go through startups, they fail, and eventually you find the right thing. And this is, I think, the right thing for me.
Well, congratulations. And it does make it nice if you don't have to worry about a guest to do it. With the 2 people, you can do it solo. You don't have to worry about it. It's just good to go with 2 people. Have your conversation. It's just like someone's listening in, eavesdropping on the conversation. So it does make it quick and easy to get those shows out.
It does. And I will say, going back to something Gary said, I do remember when Daryl reached out and said, "Congratulations, you hit your," I think it was my 6th podcast, and you said, I'm gonna put your link on my show." Now, full disclosure, I had never listened to your podcast before, and I was like, "Who is this guy?" And I start checking it out, and then I start listening, I was really appreciative at that point of somebody going, "Hey, you hit your 6th." And we can, I guess, talk a little bit later about what it takes to do a podcast. But Daryl definitely knew where I think the tipping point was for somebody in podcasting. And he said, I think you've reached a point where you're probably going to stick around for a while. I'm willing to put your link on my website.
And Michael, didn't you mention, too, you talked to Lou, and Lou said if you make it to 7, didn't he? I think he said if you get to 7, you have or is that when you kind of have a point in a podcast where you're like, am I going to continue this?
Well, interesting. Daryl, do you mind if I talk about it, or do you want to hold?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry. So Lou Mangello, who does WDW Radio, outstanding podcast. I got a chance to meet him one day, and we started talking, and he asked me, and at this point, I think I was on my 11th podcast, and he said, "Hey, man, you know right now what it takes. Chances are you're going to be sticking with it." And I've said this before previously. When I hit about actually after Daryl reached out, probably that next podcast, I said, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I did not really think through format as well as I thought, and I was really struggling. But it was when Lou actually said, "Okay, you finally are getting it." And between what Daryl had done and Lou, it kind of emboldened me to say, go forward, keep going. And I'm glad I did that. But yeah, it really was one of those things where you do need people to kind of help support you when you are starting a podcast. Definitely.
Yeah, it seems like somewhere around that 3 to 6 time frame, episodes wise, and it changes if you're not doing weekly. But if you're in a weekly show, if you don't get someone to come in and say, yeah, what you're doing is good, or I'm listening at least, a lot of people do drop out of podcasting.
Absolutely. And I think because they finally also understand there is a commitment you are making, and that you don't necessarily think about when you start doing a podcast.
Meanwhile, we have Doc Firewoman in the live Q&A that says that Cache&Release was the first geocaching podcast that she listened to regularly.
Oh, how about that?
All right. Thank you, Deborah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I could tell that you hadn't listened to Geo Gearheads because of something you had said in one of the earlier shows. And I'm like, yeah, you know what? I don't think that he listens to our show.
Yeah, well, the funny thing was, and again, full disclosure, I started listening not knowing that Cache-Maniacs had gone, and so I'm listening to Cache-Maniacs, and I think it was your last episode. I'm like, what the heck? What did I just download? And didn't realize this transition had all gone. This is probably that part where I'm like, what, huh? And so very quickly, after Daryl had actually reached out, I started aggregating more of the geocaching podcast and pulling in, and I'm glad that I've done that. I really am. But yeah, at first I was like, who's this guy? No offense.
Well, the original Cache-Maniacs series was one of those. I was sad to see it go, but I was so happy to finally wrap that one up. It was for anyone who doesn't recognize the series, because it's 4 years since we stopped producing that one now. It was a cacher or team of cachers each episode, and we had gotten to the point where we couldn't find cachers that wanted to talk with us anymore. It's just, I really don't want to talk,
I loved the show, though.
Oh, it was a great show.
Yeah, I was just like, it did, but for me, it came suddenly to an end. I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, 260 episodes, I think, is what we had produced on that show.
Impressive. It's still live. Like I said, I think
it's still out there to
iTunes.
continue. Yeah, because we didn't want to kill it off. So that's one of the reasons why we structured things the way we did, and we'll talk about that in tomorrow's recording, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's such a good concept, and I'd love to see it return, but I don't know how. Because I tried to bring back something similar without a regular production schedule, and I still just have problems getting people willing to sit down and talk for more than a couple of minutes about themselves.
Yeah.
It's funny, when we did the 2-hour podcast last year, and Daryl really encouraged, that I kind of encouraged that idea in this discussion, and then I was like, let's run with it, and it was a lot of fun to include all of these different podcasters, and it was, to me, it was very. Well, it was neat to have on because I had listened to Daryl. I listened. I think my first podcast, listening to Geocaching podcast, and then picked up on listening to Podcaster, and then I've listened to your show, Daryl, the Gearhead show, for several years now, but I listened to Daryl back on the Geocaching Podcast Show, and listened to him as he, said he was done with that one. And so it was interesting listening to different podcasts and kind of, in a sense, wishing I could, jump on one. And then, of course, Michael's came along, and I was. It's interesting that I really wasn't angling to be on it all the time, but in sort of in my back of my mind, I wish I could. I was just hoping to be on a show, and nobody else would let me be on their show. So Michael, you were the only one.
Hold on. I wasn't your first choice?
No, I didn't say that. I meant you're the only one that let me be on a show. So no, I'd never really asked to be on one before. You're the first one, so it worked out great.
All right. Well, we've talked a little bit about some of the stuff that had gone on, Michael, with your previous shows, but what were some of the things you think went well and not so well with Cache and Release?
Well, I will say this. Through the 58 episodes that we've done, what's gone well is a very kind of a relaxed idea of what this podcast really can be, and it's somewhat formatted, but it will still kind of be flexible and change. And through that, I think we've got a lot of feedback from people. So I think that's worked very well for us to change. And if anybody's listened to the show, there's things that I've introduced that 3 weeks later you may never hear of again, because I've determined it does nothing for the show, or Gary will say, we're not feeling it. I also think that just kind of our levity of geocaching in itself, I don't take it seriously. I just like to have fun and talk about it. It's also done well for the show. Things that haven't gone well, I think, a lot of it was technical. And again, Daryl has helped us out tremendously. I'm especially getting on Google Hangouts on air was a fiasco first starting out, and Gary and I would be texting each other, "Where's the link? I didn't get the link." Where? And it was a lot of issues on that. So, and Daryl's definitely helped out. I would say workflow is another thing that you have to learn, and that's been something that we're continually kind of evolving with, but the workflow's gotten a lot easier. So I would, nothing too tough, but I'll say I think we both work at this very hard to make it a good quality production. So we put a lot of time into it, and we make the mistakes in the background that not necessarily everybody sees.
Or maybe they do see sometimes.
Or maybe they do.
Well, what's interesting, too, is that we've sort of naturally worked our way in, Michael he does so much of the show, but he has sort of, it's worked out to delegate certain things about the show. I think that's really helped. We both have different strengths, and we both have different weaknesses, and so there are times I think there's really been a good thing for the show is Michael will mention something to me, and I'm still learning, and so I think it's helped just in our communication with each other. And I've also felt over time we've felt pretty comfortable about. We're just actually I've been sending something even today to Michael, and he's willing to listen because I had some things I wanted to mention to him. And he's like, well, tell me a little more about it. And so okay, so I gave him some more examples. And so we're always kind of striving to really become better and also just make the show better is one of the things we really are really driven to. Even though, like he said, we have a focus on, or we have some relaxing moments, I guess you could say, on the show, but yet I think what some people don't see is when we're not doing the show, he and I are both working very diligently and very seriously about future shows.
Well, that pre and post production is certainly an aspect that most listeners don't know about and shouldn't know about, because if if you're doing it right, it's seamless and you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, and that's, I think, going back to kind of the work leading up into it. When I started out the podcast, I realized rather quickly, you see the finished product when you're watching or listening to the podcast. You have no idea what we do ahead of time between, as Gary mentioned, we kind of split the duties. There's a lot of work, and so the hour that you get to listen to, that might be 3 hours, 4 hours, sometimes 5 hours worth of work, depending on which particular episode we're putting together. So people, I think, sometimes walk away going, boy, that must be easy. Not all the time.
No, for live programming, when I was in production classes, you were taught, for doing the live to cables kind of stuff, at least 4 hours for every 1 hour on air.
That, I would say, is very good point there. Yeah.
And Doc Firewoman in the live Q&A also says she really likes how interactive you are with your chat room, and the wide diversity of topics keeps her interested.
I think that's something that has definitely evolved let me step back. So that is one of the things I think has worked for us, is embedding our video into the website and adding a chat room. And Gary and I have slowly, not maybe intentionally, but just got very involved with the chat room. If Gary's talking, I'm usually working in the chat room, and vice versa. And we try to do that. We try to interact with everybody in the chat room. And for those of you that listen regularly, we've even given the chat room a name and the people in the chat room a name. And we're really trying to evolve that. And we try to throw a lot of different topics out. We try not to get too specific on anything, which I think gives us a little bit of that flexibility to, at the last minute, sometimes change what we're going to do. And people go, that's fine. We didn't know what to expect anyways, so that works.
Well, and the chat room has been one of those shiny objects that tends to distract hosts, so it is not an easy task to balance the chat room with actually performing. We've had back on the Geocaching podcast a number of times where hosts would just get lost in a conversation in the chat room and forget what's going on the show.
I've done that to Gary a few times where he's interviewing. I'm typing away, and I'll ask a question, and I can see immediately on Gary's face, we just talked about that. And then I've got to backpedal. Unless you guys have said that, which, okay, and so you're right, you do get very engaged. And so Gary and I have kind of split more of the duties, where we'll even go into, you do the interview, I'll moderate, and I'll keep, any interaction I have is very limited, and then we might switch the next week. So that doesn't tend to happen as much.
Yeah, and I think that really has become a positive and a real plus for our show, is that as we do that, I always joke about, I use a sports analogy that one of us is doing play-by-play and the other one's doing color, and then the one that's doing the color commentary is also the one sort of moderating the chat room and looking for little nuggets to put out there. And of course, our chat room is a little different than what some people use, because it becomes sort of its own thing. And that's the interesting thing about the way we have it set up currently, is that everybody can interact with one another within the chat room, which is great. I really like that. And then, but of course, it makes it a little difficult for whoever's watching the chat room, because once in a while there'll be a question come up that you see as possibly really relevant to the conversation, but it moves so fast because everybody's talking with about the show and with each other, and so it's become it's a sort of a dynamic entity, as it were, and so it's a little tricky. And so I like to switch it up and do the play-by-play part and have Michael try to figure out how to tame that beast once in a while, just to remind him of how tough it is.
Well, let's move on to talking about some of the production aspects, because you've mentioned already that you're using Google Hangouts on Air for your video and to sync the two of you up, and probably any guests as well. But what kind of production goes into the show, and what kind of gear are you each using to do that? And I know, Michael, you're going to be a lot like me with way too much gear.
Yeah. Gary, why don't you kind of go ahead and start off?
Start with the lowest. I don't have a lot here, which is okay. I use a blue snowball for my mic, and I've got a pop filter, and that's about Michael suggested buying this Logitech video, and so I don't use the video that comes. I'm using a laptop, but I don't use the camera that's in the laptop. I use this Logitech one. I really do think, Michael, that the one that we both use gives a very good quality to the video portion. And one thing I also did, and it was a good time to mention this, I think, is that early on in the show, I was doing the podcast from another room in the house, and it just really worked best to move it. But to move it, I needed to run a landline, and so I actually ran a landline from the other end of the house down to here and sort of create a podcasting room. And so it still needs some updating. And so one thing that I've had to do over a little bit of time, and I think the sound, as Michael's mentioned, has gotten better, is to kind of work on some parts of the room. And I've put up, I always joke about telling people that it looks like I'm homeless because I've got curtains up, just sort of, and they're not really up very well because I didn't want them to be. I want them to have that idea. So it's not the perfect sound room that I hope to have someday, but it does work. Does work well for what we have right now. But always evolving and always trying to improve what I have.
Kind of that cheap podcaster trick for sound dampening. Take your fleece blankets or a comforter and hang them up behind the microphone.
Yeah, when I first got this thing set up, and I go, "Hey, Michael, what do you think?" And he goes, "Oh my gosh, you're like echoing like crazy." And of course, Michael's very fastidious, very into the sound, which I really appreciate because it makes me think more about the sound quality. And so, that's something that I don't think I really thought. Like Michael said, I watched your show and I've watched others, or listened to other shows, and I have come to appreciate more and more the time and effort it takes to have good sound during a podcast. So, we started working on the room and making it a little bit better, and I think sound-wise it has gotten better.
Yeah, it's not easy, but I think the reason Michael's so picky is because he's the one who has to edit, and the quality of the sound makes a huge difference in the time.
Exactly.
That's one of the things I learned early on, and why I spent hundreds and hundreds of dollars on extra apparatus.
Yes.
But, Limax in the live Q&A asked something that I think is worth mentioning. He says, "I'm thinking a landline is a given," meaning an Ethernet cable. How well would a laptop work versus a desktop? And what's your thoughts first on that, Gary?
I used desktop early on, and I'm using this laptop now, and I really think it's worked great. The laptop, I think, has been fine. I don't use two screens. I think it would be nice, but I think I get too distracted too quickly about stuff like that. So I'll split the screen on my laptop as far as when I'm podcasting, I'll take one of the windows and actually don't make it very big because I don't really need to see really what's going on as much as I need to be able to view the chat room. I need to look at our show notes, and I also need to look at any kind of links that we're going to pull up during the show. So to me, the laptop, the landline, to me, the landline, the web camera, and the audio, the microphone are, to me, the three most critical factors. Is that, I mean, that's, I don't know if y'all agree, but that's really, to me, those. And this is from the non-production side, so Michael's got to go through a lot of different things that I don't really have to go through. But for the co-host side of it, I think those are the three most critical things.
Well, Michael, what's your take on that? And then I'm going to interject with mine.
Absolutely. Well, I agree with Gary that if you're the one doing most of the production, post-production, and if you're running most of the stuff, you really are going to want a desktop or a extremely powerful laptop. To give you an example, I have a desktop. It runs 12 gigs of RAM. I don't use a video card because I don't need it at this point, but the chip is a quad core. It runs extremely efficient. The one thing I don't do is I don't run audio directly into my computer, which takes a lot less of the process out of the computer at that point. The reason I have a more, I'd say, robust computer is the post-production for audio and the video that we're starting to get into, and so it's a little bit louder than a laptop, which I keep it kind of buried under the desk to minimize the noise. Yeah, and it's a PC. I would like to eventually go to Mac, but it's a PC, and it works pretty well.
All right, so here's what I tell our guests, is a landline is preferred. You can use Wi-Fi, but make sure that you're close to the router. It's always best to reboot the router about an hour or so before you record. And always use a headset, or if you have a good microphone like we do, you can use the microphone with closed ear headphones, because especially with the guests, we have a tendency for leakage.
Yeah.
But the laptop versus desktop really doesn't make too much of a difference for people using Google Hangouts, especially when you shrink the window size. So please shrink the size of the window.
And that's a really good point, yeah, because you're not taxing the computer as much.
Yeah, well, and Google Hangouts on Air does rely fairly heavily on the GPU. So if you have a fairly meager laptop, you will have some issues. But I've done it off the Chromebook before, and it doesn't really get that much weaker than my almost 3-year-old Chromebook. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this, as far as what I've got going over here, because I'm using I think almost 7 or 8-year-old laptop now as the host for the Google Hangouts.
And we're going to find out, more about that tomorrow.
Right. I'm not going to take over this show too much. All right, so Michael,
we don't want to let everything go out on this one.
Yeah, well, and this is about cache and release, not about GeoGearheads. But Michael, let's go back to what you used to do your recording.
Well, let me actually step back, because you asked another question, was kind of how we produce the show, I think, is originally. Yeah, so let me talk a little bit about that, because what we do is Gary and I, infrequently, but when necessary, we will meet during the week versus in Hangouts, or text each other, or start mailing each other. What do you think about this? And we start generating ideas, and we use Google Docs like a lot of people do, and we start a list of shows that we want to do, and we either have somebody that's committed to coming on a certain date, or we have an idea that we've started to generate. Gary is really the one that will go out and start contacting our guests and start reaching out to them. And does a phenomenal job. I could not do what Gary does. He has some contacts that I don't have, and that has been tremendous to get these guests. So we start generating this list, and as we get closer, we start putting out show notes. And ours, probably like a lot of others, is formatted, and we also ask our guests to add in a lot of their own. What do they want to talk about? What is it? Because, again, the show's about the guest. It's not about us. We do kind of a pre-show, but then we get to the crux of the guests themselves. We want them to talk about what they want to talk about. So we invite them, put stuff in there, and very frequently, and I still remember when we had West Virginia Tim, and I'm in show notes, and Tim's in there, and I can see him in there, and we're working on show notes, and I just thought that was totally cool, and I'm reading what he's typing in there. And so we really encourage that kind of commitment to building those notes going into it. The other thing for me, too, is I put, if you listen to the show, a lot of supporting audio in there, more for comical effect than anything else. But just like recently when we had Land Monkey on, and he was drinking a Canadian beer, and I'm like, I got to find audio of the Canadian national anthem. And so I will go searching for a lot of these things because I do real-time audio effects. I don't add anything after, and so I want to make sure that it's as live as possible. So I do a lot of supporting audio to go with that. And Gary and I will continually tweak a lot of those show notes prior to the show. So that's kind of how we get to the point. Those show notes might go live 3 to 4 weeks before we even have the show. And then we're kind of talking about a little bit of what I use, and I think Daryl and I are a lot of techno junkies. We definitely get into Daryl way more than me, people. I'm telling you right now. Whatever I say tonight, he's going to go about 4 times over tomorrow. Trust me. But kind of give you an idea of what I use. I have a Mackie Pro FX soundboard. Do I need it? No, not even close. It is way overkill. But and I'll come back to why I did that. But it is a very good soundboard with a very low audio floor, which I hear very little, if any, noise from this thing. But it allows me to put in a lot of different channels so I can do everything real time, and I'm very happy with that. Also really great with Google Hangouts. I tend to record, however, like I said, not directly to the computer. I record to a Roland R05 digital handheld recorder, which is fantastic. It does a great job. And the reason I do that is computers have a tendency to do hiccups, and you can lose audio or get a kind of what I call a burp in your audio, whereas with the handheld recorders, you don't. And I run all the audio directly into that recorder, and at the end of the show, I take it over to the computer. For my microphone, and I think everybody can see it, I use a Heil PR40, which I know Daryl at one time used a Heil PR40. Is that correct?
Actually, I had one, but I didn't use it. It was actually going to be for my co-host on Cache Maniacs.
Okay. Now, I will say this. I'm a big fan of the Heil PR40, but a lot of people will also tell you that a lot of podcasters use this simply because there are some famous podcasters that use a Heil PR40, and we'll say that's the de facto standard. I actually like it because it's what's considered a front-firing microphone, which means almost everything from the sides and back is rejected, not completely, but certainly reduced, that you almost have to talk directly into the microphone. That's something that, for me, is important because I don't want any extraneous sounds coming from anywhere else. Now, I am going to point out Daryl's microphone. That is something I'm considering, honestly, for the future, which is yours an RE20?
Mine's actually the 27.
Okay.
So it is a little different, but there is the new RE30, which might be a better one for podcasters.
And I saw that one, too. It's funny, I was actually looking at that. So one of the things I'm always doing is looking at my equipment and saying, what can I do with it? Can I make it a little bit better? I'm always thinking about Gary. if I beef up, can I give Gary this? I've already sent Gary my old soundboard. How can I get Gary? Yeah, how can I get Gary more stuff? Some of the other things that I use hardware-wise, I use an iPad with a program called iJingle, which allows me to basically record everything to a hot button, and at that point, I can just hit it, and it's instantaneous. So if you listen, one of the things about when I started the show, I wanted it to be as close to, if not broadcast quality. So I wanted things to flow. I didn't want a delay when I played music. I wanted to be able to instantaneous. So for those of you that are looking at software for iPads, I would say iJingle. It's a great little program. And then post-production, I use what's called Adobe Audition. I'm a big fan of Adobe Audition, although you can use Audacity, which I played with way back when, but I feel that I can do more with Adobe Audition. And frankly, what you hear in our show is pretty much what you get. I don't do a lot of post-production. I generally will take the recording, take out some of the front, the back, maybe add some vocal bass, might add some compression. And I'm going to come back to that because Daryl actually mentioned something on another show about compression. And then generally I just knock it down to an MP3 at that point. A lot of podcasters use what are called external compressors. I don't do that. I do almost everything via Adobe Audition. I did use it at one time, and my mic technique has gotten a lot better where I kind of just said, don't need it any longer. I can do that. So after the show, when we get off the air, usually within about 20 minutes, I've got the audio down to an MP3 at that point. Rarely do I have to spend a lot of time fixing it. And that's really all I use. It's a pretty simple, I think, a pretty simple setup compared to Daryl.
It sounds like it's a lot newer setup too, because most of this gear is a decade old over here.
Well, but it's impressive. Trust me, Daryl has taken us through a tour of his setup. It's impressive, people.
Well, and what's interesting too is that this is something that's definitely evolved. Michael, and I really appreciate that he, really strives for excellence, and he's able to. I mean, we used to he would take down the video and then redo the audio and then put it back up, and I think.
Michael, that was horrific.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what people forget about is that, there's other, there's iTunes, there's SoundCloud, there's different things that we do, because not everybody consumes our show the same way. Daryl and I talked about it one time too about, because I listen to Daryl's show on like Monday or Tuesday, and I always do audio for his show, but like for Caching Northwest, I tend to watch them live, so I consume them a few different ways, and I think that's something that some people forget about is they consume a podcast either they watch it live or they listen to it later or whatever it is, and they kind of forget the fact that there's more that has to go into the production of it, just more than just the way that you consume the show.
Well, Michael, you were mentioning the compression. Why don't we talk a little bit about that and what are you doing there?
So typically, for me, from Adobe Audition, it's a great digital. And if you hear people refer to DAW, digital audio workstations, it's essentially the equivalent of really the physical soundboard. And I could have chosen to really not use the soundboard and do everything through, but with compression, it really helps in a lot of ways. You have, and I'll say this, I use a hard limiter in addition to compression. If you listen to my show, I laugh out loud a lot, which can blow out some audio, so I tend to add some things such as a hard limiter to bring it back. And compression kind of fills in areas where you've got some dips and highs and kind of brings it within an area. And it's really kind of hard to explain, but you know it when you hear it. And when you hear something unfiltered that's not gone through compression, you kind of notice the difference. And I will say I'm constantly tweaking it all the time. Again, there are a lot of podcasters I listen to, and I'm always listening to their audio. How are they doing what they're doing? And I will scour their website and look what kind of equipment, and for me, it's typically at the end of the show, like I said, compression, hard limiter, maybe a little vocal booster, and some bass to it. And because I'm really nasally, people, I am a very nasal person, so I try to add a little bass. I can never talk from my chest; it all comes through my nose, and that's about it. Like I said, I did use an external compressor, gate limiter, and actually mastered that thing. I mean, I went out on YouTube and learned the heck out of that thing. The only thing it really did for me was cut off the bottom end where you didn't hear me go.
Yeah, that gate is a big deal, though.
It
Especially
is.
when you're editing.
It is, but mic technique for me really has taken care of that gate for the most part. But I occasionally, depending on who's on, I'll go through Adobe Audition and run a gate just to kind of cut off that bottom end if it's really bad throughout the show.
Sure, and the nice thing is that Hangouts actually does run its own very limited but still useful compression. And we're talking audio compression for anyone who might be getting confused, not the data compression. This is the audio compression where you're reducing the dynamic range. So you don't have that difference in the amplitude when you start talking. Your talking is always at about the same level. And data compression is what makes that file smaller so that you can actually fit it into your iPod or whatever. The gate is also much more aggressive on Hangouts, and many times I've been very thankful that the guests have that gate going.
Yeah. Again, I think for those of us that do podcasting on a regular basis, we've maybe gained some mic techniques that it's not so bad. But guests, you kind of have to walk through, and sometimes you can't control it. And I think Google does some great job on their end from helping the audio a little bit. I do want to say real quick, if anybody really wants to learn good audio, go to a church. And those guys running the soundboards at churches are phenomenal people. There are plenty of books written about live bands in churches, and I'm telling you, if you want to learn it, that's where you want to go. Plenty of books on the internet about it, though.
Meanwhile, Limax in the live Q&A says that he used to see the Heil mics advertised in the ham radio magazines, but he couldn't afford them. And yes, that is the same Heil, but the PR40 was not really designed for ham radios.
And I'm going to assume then that Limax is a ham radio operator?
I would assume that as well.
Well, Limax, I am K4AFK, so welcome, fellow ham radio operator.
And then Doc Firewoman says, talking about the sound equipment reminds her of days in leather pants, high-heeled boots, and rocker chick hair running sound for a progressive rock band in the 90s.
Ooh,
Somehow I see her with the
about
Guns
that.
N' Roses shirt, which is shredded at the bottom somehow, in addition.
See, and I'm thinking now, we've got to get her to do her own show.
Oh, yeah. Well, we've had her on. We just need to have her on again, and we got to talk about that prog rock, man. I'm a huge prog rock fan, so we'll have to bring that up next time.
See, this is one of the reasons why we thought this series would be fun, is to hopefully encourage some more people to start podcasting and get more voices out there.
Well, I just want to say this, and I know that Deb's listening, but actually Deb is going to be doing a show. Deb and I are doing a side project that we're going to be announcing here in the next 2 to 3 weeks.
Ah, cool.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's go into what you would suggest for someone who is looking at starting their own show, aside from, don't spend all the money on the equipment like I have.
Well, I would say the first thing is, especially if you have a family, you really want to talk to your family and let them know that you are making a commitment. And case in point, you know, when I first started out, you know, we were doing this on every Sunday, and my wife said, it's either the podcast or me. I'm sure going to miss her. Lovely woman, but but as in all seriousness, you really are making a commitment, especially when you're doing it live. Gary and I every Sunday are here at about 7 o'clock on Sunday, 6 o'clock his time, before the show, talking. So if you've got a family and you've got kids, you need to get them to understand that. That's a huge thing right there. You are making a time commitment. And if you can't do that, I would say that this is probably not something that's going to work for you. I'd also say look for a format that works for you. I mean, generally, first find a topic that you're enthusiastic about, but don't be afraid to look at somebody else's format and copy it at first, but then find your own format. Just kind of get some ideas of what you can do, what you can bring. It's okay to, you know, emulate podcasters because you might find that they're doing something really well, but start to etch out some ideas and you'll get noticed for it. If you listen to the Geocaching podcast, I think we all have slightly different and somewhat, or maybe even a vast difference in the way we do our shows or what the topics are, and that's what makes that great, is everybody brings something different to the table. The other thing is I'd say get very good at promoting yourself, and this is huge. I think you have to be good at social media and really promote yourself. Is it absolutely necessary? No, but beyond doing your show, you should spend time you know, on Twitter and Facebook and, you know, Instagram. Promote the heck out of yourself and don't be bashful about it. People will start to reach out and listen to your show. And I agree with Daryl, though. You don't need to buy the most expensive equipment. I know that Land Monkey was talking on their interview at Caching in the Northwest and some of the equipment he started with. That's probably a smart idea. Until you know you really want to do this, I would not invest a ton of money. If you think, hey, I've got 6, 7, 12, 15 shows, then go ahead and maybe start investing in it. But a simple webcam, your microphone. Gary, we've talked about this. To me, it's more about the topic than the audio. For those of you that have listened to The Nerdist, you know what I'm talking about. Chris Hardwick doesn't always have the best audio, but man, does he put on some good shows with some great guests, and I'll listen to that all day long, even if the audio bothers the heck out of me.
Well, and both are very important, and that is, like you said, that when you find sort of the format you want to go with, and if you do want to have guests on, I think what people need to realize is there is a lot of work that goes into getting guests, and for us, you know, we have a guest on pretty much every week, and so it is, but it's kind of a passion for me is to work on getting the guests into the show, and so I do spend a lot more time and a lot of hours working on that. I think more than what some people probably realize how much time and effort it takes, and really to get some of the guests that we have been able to get, especially some of them, like when we got Doug McRae on, good fellow that invented Ms. Pac-Man. Somebody like him is like, I just reached out to him recently because I want to have him back on the show. A guy like him, he's busy up and through like August, and you know, we schedule. You know, I can schedule people out that far. Most people don't want to be scheduled out that far, and so it's kind of an interesting balance between, you know, we're scheduled out pretty much for 2 months, and I try to keep 2 months ahead of where I'm at. But as you know, Daryl, it can be tough to get some people. I have somebody I scheduled for end of May, And what's funny about it is they were like, you're going to have to remind me because I'm not going to remember. And it's like, that's okay. I'll remind you as long as you're committed, if you're willing to be on the show for that time. We have a document that we keep, and I work on pretty hard to get people committed to that. And that's another thing, if you're going to do a new podcast, is you got to think about that. Some people do not want to commit themselves to being on a show too far out, but then again, you got to be able to have things ready. And we've had people drop. Michael and I are kind of, I guess, ready every week. If it's somebody who's fairly new or has never been on a show before, we've kind of talked about it. I mean, what do we do if we lose? If they don't want to be on the show? We had one fellow who we ended up getting on later, but he bailed on Saturday. The show's on Sunday, so. Michael and I worked it out, but there's parts of that I think really, like we've said before, you don't see it, but you've got to kind of prepare for it.
Yeah, and kind of going back to what Michael was saying, and you started off with, it reminds me a lot of the early podcast slogan, and I wish I remember who had said it, but content is king, quality is queen. In other words, good content over the quality.
Absolutely.
But you can't do one or the other. You have to have both.
Yeah, and I think that's we've always we try to put the content ahead of itself, knowing that sometimes the audio may not be the greatest, but it's still good.
But unfortunately, I think we scared Sherman 18 because she says, "I don't think I want to start a podcast anymore. Way too much work."
No, I will tell you, yes, it's work, but it is what you make out of it. And so, Sydney, reach out to me. We can always talk about some ideas or something like that for you.
Absolutely. And she will be on our podcast episode that's coming up as well.
I'm actually looking forward to that.
She'll have a chance to pick our brains, and hopefully we can talk her back into it.
Yeah, this wasn't meant to scare anybody away.
No, we don't want to scare everyone away. We just want you to be prepared.
Yes.
Start planning, and we'll talk about some of that on the actual show. Because White Coaster actually had a good question. With all of the video produced by cachers and others, do you think that the future of podcasting must have the video content, and can the audio podcast survive much longer?
That's an interesting question, and I think they both coexist. Some people do not consume video all the time, and here's a perfect example. Joshua Johnson, the geocaching vlogger, pretty much all video. I love watching his shows, and I split my time between YouTube and audio, but I'm primarily an audio podcast listener. And so I think it's not going to be, are you going to take one over another? I think it's what you tend to want to consume the most of. We actually got into the video because of Daryl here. We're just like, how is he doing this? This is really cool. We added it, but I know that my base listeners are audio listeners. I know this for a fact. I know how it gets consumed, but we've got a small and growing group for video, but I don't think it right now is ever going to overtake the audio aspect of our podcast at this point. I don't know. What do you think, Daryl? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm kind of in the same boat. On GeoGearheads, I think we're at less than 0.5% are actually watching the videos. But we have that for the people who want it, and there are a number of people who do listen to YouTube. They don't really watch it; they listen to it. So that's just with the video from the live Hangouts, that's a great way to get in there on YouTube. But I think the audio podcasts are going to survive. There's a lot of push in like the new Google Play podcast support. Won't do video. It is audio only. And there's a reason for that. It's very lightweight, so especially in developing markets where bandwidth is an issue, you can use it very easily and affordably, but also it doesn't require your full attention. So a lot of people do listen to podcasts when they're working and when they're driving, when you can't watch videos. Now, maybe once we get autonomous cars, our audiences are going to start diminishing, but I think there's still going to be a use for it, and I don't know how many people tell me they listen to the shows while they're caching on the trail solo.
And I'll be honest, a lot of times if I'm out, if it's not geocaching, if I'm out hiking, that's how I consume a lot of my podcasts. Which, being in nature, it's not that I want to shut it off, but I listen to a lot of podcasts, so I have to catch up with them. And so, yes, audio predominantly, and whenever I can listen to it. Even sometimes grocery shopping, that's how I listen.
Well, and the bulk of people listening to like the new shows tend to be people who are doing their daily workouts. So it's all about that you can listen without it taking your full attention away. And like Doc Firewoman says, I love audio podcasts since I have 2 hours of commute time every day, and our 13-hour drive to Savannah this week, many podcasts were listened to.
Yeah,
very good point.
That's really kind of changed, I think, over maybe the past, I don't know how many years, but back in the day, people you listen to the radio. I mean, or you listen to a CD, or if you go way back, something like cassette players and 8-tracks for those that remember those days. But nowadays you can stick your cable in your phone and listen to it on the way to work and back. I have an hour, a little over an hour to and from. So I'm kind of like Deborah. I've got 2 hours in the car, so there's plenty of opportunity there to listen to shows. And nowadays it's so much easier to do that. But I think that there's one thing though that even though we're all talking about the fact that we really love the audio, I kind of see there needs to be what we have and what you have too, and that is a need for a live show, which I think is important, and also the video. I appreciate the shows that don't do live and don't do audio, sort of like Podcasher, but I really think there's a medium. That medium I think is important. I think it will become more important over time as well.
Yeah, I think live streaming is going to remain largely video, and I'm not sure why that is, but it seems like live people like to have that video, and I want to say I don't really know, but it's just like a gut feeling. It's because it's the live, you're focusing on it aspect, that you're part of that live event. The big reason most people tell me they like watching Periscope videos is because they feel like they're engaged and they're part of the hunt. So I think that's a big part of why video is so popular for live streaming.
Yeah, and I think now that Facebook's jumped in, now that we're kind of in this technical race here, who can own live streaming, and now you've got YouTube also kind of jumping in. I think you're going to see, when we're talking about geocaching, a lot more geocachers doing live streaming, especially with data becoming a little bit cheaper here in the States. We're getting bigger plans. We don't necessarily always have to run off Wi-Fi. There's areas where you just might get cell data, and you can still go out and stream. And like you said, Daryl, I think people are like, "Wow, I'm a part of that." Hence why I like watching a lot of Joshua's videos or Scott Burke's videos, or when you go out, you kind of you get to see a different take on geocachers and what they're doing, and it's a lot of fun. Even if it's for a minute or two. That's really cool to see.
And with that, I think we're going to wrap this up because we've been going for over an hour. And I know, Michael, you've got to get to sleep. But before we let you do that,
yes,
tell us again how we can find you and the show.
All right. Well, guys, you can find Cache and Release at cacheandrelease.com. If you haven't been there lately, it has been a redesign, so make sure you check it out. Social media, everything is under Cache and Release. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Periscope, Instagram, pretty much everything. And we're on Sunday nights every night, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, out at cacheandrelease.com/live. So if you haven't had a chance to see the show, make sure you check it out. It's a lot of fun.
And Gary, anything that you want to plug for yourself?
I'm G-Slink or on Twitter at Gary Slinkard. I really just take this last second to, thank Michael on bringing me on and staying with me, allowing me to stay with the show, and it's been a great ride so far. Hopefully, it'll last a lot longer too.
Oh, we're married to this, Gary. We're sticking around. No divorces here.
No.
So you guys have at least another 25 years, right?
Sure.
or until the medium dies.
Exactly. Well, hopefully, we're not 10 years from now. We're talking about the downfall of podcasting.
Exactly.
All right, and we're going to leave you with one bit of advice from Wet Coaster, who says, please don't talk about great data plans. You have some Canadians watching this.
That's kind of why I mentioned it, I think.
I think I